By the start of the Cryocene, bamboo has become one of Serina's most successful plant groups and makes up entire forest communities in some subtropical equatorial habitats. Fast-growing, hardy, and adaptable already in its ancestral form, it has begun to evolve in several new directions by 50 million years post-establishment. Illustrated above are examples of the growth habits of 4 groups of bamboo present on Serina by this time, labeled A, B, C, and D. A is the ancestral plant from which B, C, and D descend, and grows individual bamboo canes directly from a large underground rhizome, which can spread almost indefinitely in any direction via underground stems. This ability to quickly spread across Serina in its early history initially gave bamboo an advantage over most other plant groups, though this rate of spread was only possible in very fertile and wet climates. Bamboo forests of this growth habit typically grew and spread for a lengthy period of time, anywhere from a few decades to over 100 years, before flowering, dying, and slowly regenerating over the next 10 to 20 years from seedlings, a habit retained in many Serinin species today, including the desert bamboo, which takes this behavior to its extreme. The individual canes of these colonies are short-lived, lasting only a few years, and are typically determinate in growth. They can only grow to a certain height before they stop developing. To keep the plant growing, new canes are constantly produced from the root system to replace those which die. The roots are shallow, without deep anchoring taproots. Over time, however, mutant populations of bamboo would gradually arise with less aggressive rates of spreading, but which concentrated more of their energy on producing fewer but larger, taller, and longer-lived individual stems. Their growth rate was slower, but it was indeterminate. Given time, they could grow larger than their competitors, with canes that last much longer. This was the first step to reaching a more tree-like shape and growth pattern, and was particularly beneficial in drier ecosystems, or those where the soil was fairly poor in nutrients. By concentrating on just a few trunks and increasing its size more gradually, a plant could better grow in less ideal environments, including in the shadow of more vigorous Type A bamboo colonies. Biding their time on what little nutrition they can eventually grow beyond the canopy and slowly shade out their competition. B-type bamboo can still produce canes from the underground root, but far fewer than the ancestral bamboo and much closer to the main trunk, resulting in a small clump of trees together rather than a sprawling colony. In the natural pattern of forest succession, B-type bamboo forests tend to gradually replace A-type forests over the course of about a century, for though Type A bamboo is quick to colonize open land, by the time it flowers, the ground will be too shaded by maturing Type B bamboo for most of their seedlings to survive. Next is the Type C growth pattern. An extension of Type B, this bamboo produces only one trunk and few or no secondary canes. Its rhizome is reduced, and instead it produces a single, deep taproot to probe the soil for water and deeply buried minerals. Its growth is perhaps the slowest of all, but is the only type which can reliably take root and survive on dry, exposed hillsides or areas with little soil. Its singular trunk can become several meters wide, though remains hollow and never becomes woody like a proper tree. The only living tissue within it occurs in a ring-shaped cross-section. This makes a type C bamboo tree lighter than a woody plant like a sunflower tree, which makes it potentially more vulnerable to high wind or weather when young, but considerably less likely to topple over under their own weight at very large sizes. The first representative of a type C bamboo was the monovitis tree of the Middle Tempesenic. Like this ancestor, many modern examples still flower only once, often at a very advanced age, in such an extravagant show that they use up all their energy and die back to give their offspring a chance to grow in their place. Others, however, have become truly indeterminate growers, growing throughout their life and flowering less abundantly but more frequently, even every year, producing fewer seeds at a time, but surely many more over the course of a longer lifespan. In the case of trees that don't die back after flowering, methods to ensure their seeds get far enough away that they don't compete with their parent have had to evolve, and the descendants of the monovitis tree use their symbiotic ants. Now, not only do these ants live within their tissues, prune away competitors, and clean them of insect pests, but they disperse their seeds for them across wide reaches of land, each new queen taking a seed with it when it flies away to start its own new colony. It finds a suitable sunny patch of soil and begins to dig a burrow for its new colony, taking the seed underground. When it sprouts, they instinctively guard it and keep its patch of soil weeded, and when it is big enough, it begins to grow swollen bolls at its nodes, which the ants then move into. A single colony will stay with a tree for up to 20 years, the maximum lifespan of certain queen ants, but eventually a queen will die and the colony will collapse. Fortunately for the tree, however, it takes very little time for another young queen to move in and start the cycle again. Indeed, so valuable is a mature tree as a nest site that dozens of queens will fight for the right to use it. Several may even start nesting at different heights within the trunk, but eventually the colonies will meet and have battle. That, with the largest army, always wins. Because type C bamboo doesn't reproduce asexually at all and only spreads via seeds, it has a higher rate of mutation than other bamboos, giving it improved resistance to pathogens and a better ability to adapt to changing environmental conditions than bamboos that only rarely reproduce sexually. Type C bamboo has taken the ant symbiosis to its greatest pinnacle so far by the start of the Cryocene, being entirely dependent on certain ant species to reproduce. But representatives from all growth types provide ants with shelter and sometimes food in exchange for keeping them free of pests and competition. Type A bamboo is the least dependent on them, however, for it grows the most aggressively already that it can compete against most other plants well enough by itself that its symbiotes are simply extra help. The ancestral type A bamboo's rapid growth may in fact have been a contributing factor in later, slower growing species adopting the help of ants in the first place, for they could counteract their less vigorous biology if their helpers pruned away other plants from around them before they were overtaken. Eventually, however, the more vigorous bamboo would begin to attract ants of their own, specifically for the purpose of putting the odds back in their favor. Today, hundreds of bamboo species exist, with many more symbiotic ant species, all fighting a largely hidden battle for turf against each other, trimming away the branches of their neighbors if any two plants get too close to each other. The Serina bamboo forests exhibit universal crown shyness to a particularly obvious degree, because anywhere that the branches of two different trees with different ant colonies touch is soon pruned away by the ants living on one or the other. Type D bamboo is the result of an entirely different evolutionary path. A mutation has occurred in these plants that results in two very different methods of growth in a single plant. Canes rise up from the rhizome and expand their mass from the top, adding whorls of leaves and gaining in height by building upwards like almost every other plant. But this type of bamboo also grows from the bottom up, random sections of the rhizomes gradually lengthening underground until they rise out of the soil, in some places as high as 10 meters, raising the bases of the plant's canes up with it, from under the ground to quite a ways above the soil. In this manner, type D bamboo, which is otherwise very similar in its manner of growth to type A bamboo, is able to reach much greater heights as it becomes supported by multiple woody trunks in its old age and towers above its competition that doesn't exhibit the mutation. Of all the bamboos so far to evolve, only this one could be called a tree in the strictest of sense, for with its elevated rhizome, it could be said to have a solid, proper trunk. Canes still die back frequently and re-sprout from the trunk, but with the rhizome now high above the forest floor, they don't need to struggle up through the shaded understory and can grow in the sun from the start. Nonetheless, though type D bamboo is more competitive in dense forest environments than type A bamboo, it's much less suited to colonizing open expanses of land. For when its rhizome rises out of the soil, the canes that grow from it lose their rooting and become wobbly and vulnerable to being broken off. In the forest, they can lean on their neighbors for support, but in exposed areas, they typically blow over in the wind once the rhizome breaks out of the soil and its stabilizing presence on the shoots. The two bamboo types have thus begun to niche partition, type D thriving in forests, and type A in open environments. Because type D cannot survive except in a forest environment of mostly type A bamboo to support it, however, its long-term survival is linked with the other growth type, meaning that in order to continue to survive, it must remain competitive, but not to the point of totally outdoing its competitors, for in an ironic twist, it needs them to survive itself. Type D, like type A, eventually flowers and dies back to the ground as well, and is succeeded just like it by types B and C in a healthy forest community. The final climax trees to dominate a forest in the end, however, are usually not bamboo at all. They are slow-growing, long-lived sunflowers, which may spend decades biding their time in the shade before emerging to take their place in the canopy. On Earth, the mangrove biome is one of the most unusual of natural environments, consisting of a varied tapestry of largely unrelated types of plants that have adapted a high tolerance for saltwater. It's a habitat of constant change, on the edge of land and sea. The rise and fall of the tides submerge large tracts of it every day, only to leave them high and dry again a few hours later in an endless cycle. The roots of the trees in the mangrove catch soil and sediment washed in by the waves, trapping it, and over time extending the beach outwards into the water, so that over many areas the shore extends out further and further, creating new land that other plants can eventually colonize. Mangroves are builders, living a life of extreme, literally caught between two worlds. Earth's mangroves are based on a variety of plants, but most notably trees of the genus Rhizophora, the true mangroves. In the thin belt of subtropical climate Serina retains by the start of the Cryocene, an analogous biome has formed from an entirely different branch of the plant family tree, the mangrove bamboo. Mangroves are a hardy, salt-tolerant bamboo variation found only along the subtropical coastlines of Serina's equator, initially sprouting on the beach, but eventually spreading a considerable distance out into the ocean. They are a distant variety of type D bamboo, immediately recognizable by the plant's large, elevated rhizomes, which in mature colonies stretch above and out of the ground as thick, woody trunks, regularly dipping back into the soil and coming out again, almost like a sea serpent moving through water. The strange appearance is, of course, a result of the plant's novel tendency to expand from the roots up until in places the plant's root system literally pushes itself out of the ground, sometimes to heights of 20 feet. Unlike most other bamboo, which has developed this mutant growth behavior, however, mangroves don't produce large canes out of these trunks. Their shoots are stunted and never become hardened, but rather grow from the tops of the highest rhizomes as small clumps of thin, leafy reeds that flex, rather than break, in the face of wind or water. Mangroves are thus the only representative of this growth habit that can survive and even thrive on their own, without requiring the support of neighboring plants. Unlike earth mangroves, mangroves are not singular trees, but rather large colonies that spread underground and through the water. Though a seedling must initially take root on a beach, once it reaches a few years old, it begins to send out runners that take root some distance from it, including out into the water. Colonies can spread as far as 3 miles from the actual shoreline, formed by floating rhizomes that have spent long anchoring roots through the water, sometimes as far as 100 feet, and buried themselves in the sand to hold the colonies of floating trunks and shoots in place. Once established far from shore, over the years the connecting tethers of rhizome that originally connected the land-rooted section of the colony with the floating one may degrade, producing large floating forests far from shore that eventually accumulate enough sediment around their free-floating roots to produce a new island. A mangrove's life begins as a large seed suspended from its parent's upper shoots in a clump of 3 or 4 similar seeds, each encased in long green pods. Whereas both bamboo die back after seeding, the mangrove continues to grow, nourishing the seed with enough food and water that it begins to sprout before even falling off the parent plant. A long taproot extends from the bottom of the seed pod, breaking through it and reaching down to the water. The seed pods will only be released once it is several feet long, and sufficiently well grown that the pod will now float upright, weighed down by the root, but kept floating by a pocket of air stored in its upper section. Well endowed with food, a seed can survive while floating in the water for as long as 6 months, during which time it will likely have been carried far away from its parent colony by the tides. Eventually, it is likely to be washed onto the beach, where its root can catch into the sand. Once this happens, it begins to anchor itself at a remarkable rate, its taproot growing as much as 5 inches a day for several days until it is securely held in place. By now, its food reserves will have run low, having just enough sugar left to allow the seedling to put out its first leaf, a long, unbranched blade about 3 feet long. From here on its growth is slow for the first year or so, as it concentrates more on establishing deep anchor roots to prevent it being washed back out to sea than on upward growth. Once this is done, however, it begins to put out numerous shoots and to spread along the beach. A young mangrove resembles more a bed of rushes than a young forest, but within a few more years, as the rhizomes grow above the ground and lift the shoots off the sand, the forest begins to take shape. As it spreads outwards through traditional underground rhizomes, the leading edges of the colony stay small, never extending far enough down the beach that they are totally covered by the sea, for though their roots can handle this, their stems would drown. Only the runners produced from the older, woody rhizomes above the ground can grow out away from the shore, keeping their shoots above the high tide line. These old, woody rhizomes grow higher and higher upwards, their rhizomes contorting and twisting, developing a hard protective bark, and arc out over and into the water. Eventually, they stop producing underground stems altogether, spreading by sending down long woody roots to anchor the branches of the rhizomes that stand above the water. On Serina's coasts, the strange growth habit of type D bamboo has found an environment where its mutation is very advantageous over those bamboo that only spread underground. It's only when the rhizomes have become large, woody, and above the sediment that a colony can survive actually in the ocean, as the roots can only grow in the thick sea mud if oxygenated by the portions that arc above the water, and the shoots could not survive being buried underwater for any length of time. The canes of any traditionally growing bamboo, lacking any rhizomes inclined to grow taller and out of the mud and seawater, would quickly drown in the environment that the mangrove thrives in, and their roots would suffocate in the mud. It is also only here that the mangrove's ancestor was able to evolve the smaller and less vigorous canes from which its leaves sprout, for in this extreme habitat there was no traditionally taller and more aggressive bamboo to compete with it for light. Mangroves have a longer lifespan than any other primitive colony-producing bamboo, for they don't die after flowering. Rather, they bloom modestly every few years, after which individual canes die, but the rhizome survives, sprouting new canes to replace those which degrade. Because they spread indefinitely outwards away from the spot where they initially sprout, and the newer parts of the colony regularly become detached from the old, mangroves could be considered biologically immortal. Portions growing on any given coastline could easily be 500,000 years old, or even more, and may have originally germinated hundreds of miles from their current locations. Sometimes a remnant of the same genetically identical colony might remain there, a single organism split into two over the eons. Mangroves are thus sometimes referred to as an altering name, migrating mangroves. Life of the mangrove forest. Mangroves are a hub for life, both terrestrial and aquatic. Mangroves are considered a foundation organism, their presence stabilizing the sediment, building land, and over time providing an environment for the colonization of thousands of other species. The islands that gradually form around their roots eventually rise far enough out of the waves for less salt-tolerant land plants and animals, like the red reed canary thrush pictured at top right, which feeds on insects near water and is abundant both in the mangroves and in freshwater environments, to survive, while the trunk and branch-like rhizomes themselves form a foundation for epiphytic plants to gain a foothold in the sun while keeping their roots safely out of the dangerous waters below. Countless birds nest in the mangroves, both those that fly out to sea to feed on fish, like the little gull-like violet thornsprite, a piscivorous descendant of early Serina insectivores that now only comes to land to nest, and those which make a living directly within the forest itself, probing for small invertebrates in the mud, like the pair of plover-like ruddy groovecocks above, shown picking earthworms from the mud with their long bills. A descendant of the stiltskins of the Tempesenic, it shares an ancestry with the variety of larger heron and stork-like waders that hunt for fish in the forest's shallow pools for a variety of prey, including whiskered, catfish-like eel snakes, burrowing crayfish, and Sicilian-like species that raise their young in underwater nests dug into the shore. But one of the waders doesn't share a close relation. With a long, sickle-shaped bill curved upwards at its tip, the lower bill longer than the upper, this filter-feeding, flighted basal pelicanary shares a method of filter feeding with the balloon and the blorca, with a tongue edged in hair-like cilia, but is unrelated. It has a common ancestor harking back to the stiltskins. A very colorful, rail-like bird descended from the gallywalt, meanwhile, has evolved a large bill suited to cracking clamshells, picking the mollusks from the roots of the mangrove during low tide, but not actually swimming itself. From the gallywalt line have also emerged the duck-like Serina waterfowl, a widely diverse group of semi-aquatic birds with webbed feet that still retain a powerful ability of flight. A pair of some small dimorphic species, the duller hen pictured with 3 young chicks resting on her back, can be seen swimming away from the mangrove forest to feed. The mangroves even have an endemic lineage of symbiote ant, one which takes advantage of its host plant without contributing as much as its ancestors did. The mangrove ants still nest in the hollow bowls that form on the emerged rhizomes of mature mangroves, but as there are few other insects near the area that would try to harm their host, they don't actively protect it, nor do they eat the bitter, salty mangrove plant themselves. Instead, they simply use the plants for shelter, emerging from their nests at the daily low tide mark to scour the newly turned sediment for any little pieces of organic refuse that they gather and take home to the nest to eat. From scraps of algae and plankton to pieces of dead fish or bird. When the tide comes back in, the ants scurry back to the safety of their nests, which have only one entrance at their lowest point. As the waters rise, they cover the nest completely, but the colonies remain full of air like a diving bell, giving the ants refuge until the waters recede again. Because the mangrove is no longer directly benefiting from the ant's presence, the small hollow bulbs along its roots are no longer ideal, ready-made lodging for ant colonies to move into. In order to make them livable, the ants must chew their tunnels into the spongy tissue, causing the root to grow a larger bowl as it heals from the damage. The mangrove ant's relationship with its host is slowly transitioning to one of parasitism. The ants, one of only a few insects to thrive near the sea, are preyed upon by mudwickets and small tweezer-billed songbirds called ditzes, named for their seemingly drunken tendencies to turn upside down while scurrying along the branches in search of ants to eat, often spontaneously dropping from a perch, some doing a somersault in the air, and landing on a lower perch to catch an insect.